And now we move on to the last session of the XTC Bootcamp today, and that will be given by Naveen Natraj from Evercore. Naveen is a senior managing partner of Evercore's corporate advisory business with over 20 years of experience. He has advised technology clients in multiple transactions. The notable ones include Grubhub in its merger with JustEatTakeaways.com, Blue Jeans on its recent sale to Verizon, and Apollo in its investment in Expedia. Prior to Evercore, Naveen was a founding partner at Saturn Venture Partners. So with that, please welcome Naveen. He's going to be talking to us about positioning your startup for a future exit. Naveen.
Great, thank you, Reggie. Really appreciate it. And hello, everyone. This is my first XTC. I'm delighted to be here. And I think it's just worth saying that in the environment we're in and all of the inequities therein, I think the true foundation of this country is entrepreneurialism. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for all of the effort that you put in. To keep this, economy humming and, keeping all of us, moving forward. So thank you for everything that you do. Maybe just a little bit of backdrop here. So I've been an M&A banker for 25 years, focused on technology. As you know, it remains one of the more active sectors in terms of mergers and acquisitions. Largely because of the rapidly changing environments that we seem to be constantly operating in. The technology evolutions, legacy companies having to evolve business models, competitive dynamics, et cetera. So if you kind of look at M&A in aggregate, and I'll touch upon the COVID environment in a second. Tech M&A usually constitutes about 25 to 30% of all M&A globally. And as you probably have seen in the environment we're in, mergers and acquisitions are down very materially, down 75, 80%, since March. But where transactions have actively continued is in the tech space. So in the intro you heard, I sold Blue Jeans to Verizon, just announced the Grubhub Just Eats deal, which was was entertaining to say the least in terms of the competitive dynamic. And by the way, as a consequence, I didn't have time to put a presentation together, so I'm going to a little bit kind of talk to you, and then let's make this really interactive with questions. And why is that? And when you kind of look at what's happened here, there've been other deals too. Microsoft has made 2 acquisitions at scale, Affirmed and Metaswitch, and Intel's made a series of acquisitions, So the tech landscape continues to be active, and largely because many of these trends that all of you are innovating towards have been accelerated, right? In what's happening in this environment. And, there's such a shortage of high-skilled labor, that the acquisition appetite, as far as we can tell from our clients, on the larger clients on the buy side, and over the years I've represented Samsung on plenty of acquisitions, including the Harman deal that they did a couple of years ago. I would say the M&A appetite seems to be strong. I think we've all figured out how to do M&A remotely without in-person interaction. So I would say while there's been a thaw in the broader M&A world, I think selective and strategic tech M&A continues. The obvious challenges that you feel, that you face in an environment like the one we're in is how do you value companies, right? There's such volatility. Clearly, buyer and seller perspectives on valuation adjust at very different paces. Buyers adjust right away if there's a downturn. They don't adjust as quickly when there's a snapback like the one you've had. I think most buyers are sitting there saying valuations are a little bit, out of whack with reality. Sellers, on the other end, don't think a sharp downturn necessarily means they're creating any less value in the longer term. And so, but despite that, I think there's just been a constant activity. So that's a little bit about the macro environment. And, but let's get to kind of the point of this discussion, which is the positioning, for a future exit. And listen, I think that's a complicated question on many levels, right? I mean, it's do you really plan, your strategy to, stay an independent company and you get acquired? I mean, everyone says, companies should be bought, not sold. I mean, and there's some truth to that, right? You create, you innovate, you create, your business evolves to be successful, and and someone should logically show up. I think that's a perfectly good strategy. But in a lot of cases, to get escape velocity to be a true independent player, the game's gotten a lot harder, right? I mean, the amount of capital you need to raise, the infrastructure that you need to build to get to scale is complicated. And I think a lot of companies do, innovate in a very specific realm with an eye to getting acquired by a small number of buyers on the other end. So again, the answer really depends on where you are on the spectrum. But usually, I mean, in terms of, for a successful M&A exit, there has to be a confluence of, getting to the buyer at the right time and addressing an important need for them, right? And so let's work backwards from there, right? So I guess my first perspective would be, how do buyers, why do companies acquire, right? And there are a lot of different reasons. And, for the earliest stage companies, in a lot of ways, it's outsourced R&D and acqui-hires. I mean, the largest companies in the world cannot innovate fast enough. And the best and brightest are leaving and creating their own companies. And to keep and enhance the talent, they have to bring folks in. And that's, if you look at the volume of M&A measured by number of deals, that's where most of the activity is. Sub a couple of $100 million, in many cases, sub $100 million, where it's just, acquiring talent. So, and if you're in that mindset where you've got seed funding, you're contemplating VC, or you have a Series A, maybe you're contemplating a Series B, you recognize the road is longer. I think, being proactive about, that usually is a good window to think about it, because, a pure acqui-hire, when you've raised $150 million of capital, becomes a lot more complicated given your cap stack, because there is a finite limit to how much the buyers would pay. I mean, so for a acqui-hire type situation, I think, recognizing early that, you're raising the next $150 million to go build, the company's probably not the optimal value creation strategy for the capital that you've raised to date. I think if you have that, I think the acqui-hire, strategy is a perfectly good one. And this is where most of the activity is. And I think from buyers' perspectives, they, like it cleaner, right? The last thing they want to do is negotiate a complex, buyout given a, complicated capital structure where the founders aren't being, appropriately rewarded and things of that nature. So that's one category. When you get to a slightly more scale, and if your business is truly taking off, and you have differentiated technology, a lot of times you see the incumbents in the space that you're disrupting, or someone trying to enter the sector that you're in, look to make an acquisition. And I'll use the Blue Jeans one as an example, right? I mean, they clearly had been around for a long time, had built a very, competitive product. Zoom came in with a different business model, blew the cover out the door, right, in terms of their growth with the freemium model and the adoption. And then COVID hit. And when, Verizon looked around and said, okay, I want to be a part of this growth trajectory. What do I do? Blue Jeans was there perfectly, and had built to a certain scale, 100 million plus of revenues, and they bought it. So I think, that's the second when, as you think about your strategy and company, kind of looking ahead 3, 4, 5 years, when the trend you're betting on becomes more mainstream, who are the parties that are most, strategically benefited and competitively impaired if you were to go to someone else's hands? A lot of the times M&A happens and this is what we love, and I think the Grubhub situation is a good one, right? Where there's one unique asset and there are multiple buyers. And that's when you get outsized outcomes, right? So I think, even at the earlier stages, kind of looking ahead 3, 4, 5 years, understanding the confluence of who are you going to, competitively threaten and who are you going to strategically enhance. Have that list in your head very clearly and start building those relationships. Because that's the most important point, which is M&A deals don't happen when you hire a banker and someone makes a phone call, right? These are you, especially for earlier stage companies. They happen when you have sponsors within these organizations. They have you in their dashboard of got to watch out for this company, right? Either in a positive way or in a competitive way. And you got to build on that perception over a period of time. And either that causes them to proactively approach you, which is the earlier point about, it's better to be bought, not sold. That's ideal. Or if you've got an approach, or if you've reached a stage where you want to proactively precipitate a process, people are aware of you. Nobody wakes up, I promise you, the stats are like staggering. I think, speaking to the head of strategy at one of the largest companies in the world, and I think they get something like 50 to 60, companies shown to them in various different ways, board members, it bubbles up from the organization, bankers calling a day. I mean, that's a staggering amount to sift through. So unless you have, a business sponsor within these organizations, specifically in the business unit that you either enhance or threaten, it's very rare that they get a phone call and decide within a short period of time they want to buy a company. These are discussions that need to be nurtured and very carefully thought through. And of course, decision makers evolve at these companies, so you have to watch that landscape and build it. Again, I guess the overarching point would be, it's think ahead of who really needs you competitively or otherwise. Start building awareness, build relationships, and awareness can be built in a lot of different ways. Other influencers, as an example, if you're a silicon company, customers could influence the buyer universe. A lot of times, companies are bought because, with their firm networks, right? Which Microsoft just paid north of $1 billion for. I think what happened there was, AT&T picked up the phone and called Microsoft and said, buy this company. And, and that's important. Getting, again, it depends on what your business model is, but if there's a common end customer, the customer can weigh in and influence the decision. So there are a lot of different ways to position yourself, but I think thinking about it on a very proactive basis, I think is critical. And I know all of you have a lot on your plate in terms of, building your own businesses. Raising capital and whatnot. But I think having an eye to the exit, I think is a good thing, especially because we're in a world where, IPOs, the number of IPOs has shrunk materially from the past. Companies are private for longer. Part of the reason was there was a lot of private capital that was available, and with SoftBank taking a step back, we'll see how long that game, how that changes. But but the public markets do want companies that are a little bit more mature, which means you need to raise more capital to get to that point. And so I think having a very early gut check on whether you want to go the distance or try to get acquired, I think that's an important decision you have to make yourself, and then plan towards it. And then, have a very clear idea of who the companies are that are going to buy you. It's very rare that someone comes completely out of left field and buys your company. It happens. But those are anecdotal as opposed to, the norm. So I'll take a pause there. I've been talking at you. I'm sorry I didn't have the chance to put slides together, but hopefully that was somewhat coherent. And, why don't we open it up to Q&A?
All right. Thank you so much, Naveen. So folks in the audience, as before, if you have a question for Naveen, please use the raise hand feature. And we're also monitoring the chat feeds. So while we wait, Naveen, let me ask you a question. You have advised many startup companies on sales to large strategic buyers. Can you share with us a best example of what you think the company was successful in its exit?
Yeah, a great question. Lot of examples, but let me, I'll hone in on one. This was earlier in my career, and it always kind of stayed with me, right? We sold a company called Flareon to Qualcomm, for $800 million.
Mm-hmm.
Flareon was, spun out of Lucent, raised a couple $100 million, and were innovating in what was called, OFDMA, which became, which was a different modulation technology as compared to what was then 3G, which was CDMA based. And, it was at one level a science project, but it made perfect sense, for data to be, coded in a certain way as opposed to voice traffic, and we were right in that transition, right? And, the company burned through the cash, very limited, business adoption, but had core innovation, right? And, Qualcomm's first bid, I think, was like $150 million. And we eventually sold it 4 months later for 850. And the reason simply was there was just absolutely fundamental technology there, right? And fast forward to today, Qualcomm would say it's the best acquisition they ever made. OFDMA became the underpinnings of what is now called LTE or 4G, which allowed them to maintain their significant market position transitioning from 3G to 4G, right? And by the way, it's still the underlying modulation scheme for 5G. So it's and my point in raising that is, they're focusing on fundamental innovation, which is critical, is usually a really good strategy, right? And so to me, that one stayed with me because we were able to take something that was, in a lot of ways compromised, but there was this underlying nugget of innovation that we were able to kind of chip away, exploit. Obviously, we made it competitive. For those of you who remember, this was back in the WiMAX days, and so we had a competitive dynamic with Intel and Qualcomm, and it became a must-have asset. And so, again, my takeaway from that is, focus on the few things that you're really good at, and really exploit that.
Yeah, great example, Naveen. It's a small world. I was in Qualcomm the last many years, and I was on the other side doing due diligence on receipts. So, And
by the way, this was not a setup. This was not a setup. Really just did that.
Absolutely not. But yeah, I think all the points you made were very resonant, and as it leads into 5G, possibly into 6G, that's become a fundamental technology. We do have another question from JP Ellis, and the question is, what if we have various subparts of our business, let's say a B2B unit as well as a B2C unit? For example, lending tech we sell to banks and that we use ourselves. Do we try to find a single comp for both, or are we finding comps for each unit?
That's a great question. Listen, I would say if you're creating value in both, and if there are very different multiples, absolutely, I think break it out and exploit the sum of the parts. If someone isn't going to show the buyer, what you're worth, if you're not going to do it, they're certainly not going to proactively do it, right? So if there's a way to think about businesses that are sum of the parts, I think it's absolutely critical to, if there's reason to think about businesses in the sum of the parts basis, absolutely critical to highlight the value, right? And again, I think in terms of the relevant comps, there may be, again, we see this a lot. Some businesses have a growing SaaS component and, but a piece of legacy software. So clearly very different multiples. So you have to, again, multiples are really a factor of growth and ultimate profitability, right? So you may talk about things in terms of revenue multiples today because you're not yet profitable, but there's a trajectory that you're on that would get you to profitability once you get to a steady state. I think showing growth adjusted multiples for different parts of the business, I think it's absolutely critical. I don't know if that's responsive to your question, but I would say, and by the way, if you're not going to point that out to a buyer, who else is, right? So you have to kind of force that discussion. Now, do buyers always pay for it? No. unless they're forced to. If it's a competitive dynamic, yeah, I think that's when you see people come out and really put big prices on the table when it becomes a must-have asset. But I think it's absolutely incumbent on you to kind of, force thinking at the buyer in a more creative way.
Yeah, thanks, Naveen. Actually, JP had a couple of questions. Then you answered the broader one too about valuation as it relates to comps in the sectors. So I think his question is covered, or questions are covered. We also have a question from Matt, who has raised his hand. Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Rajiv, and hey, Naveen. Could you talk about, are there good reasons for a startup to hire an investment banker, and likewise, are there not good reasons? And also, does it matter if you're hiring a banker to help you raise capital versus talk to a few interested buyers versus run a process? What are the kind of pitfalls of those different situations, and what advice could you give?
Right. Listen, I think it's a really good question because, it's not, I don't want to, I'm not going to talk my book, right? I mean, there are a lot of situations where having a banker probably doesn't make sense, especially if it's if it's one of those where you've cultivated and built a relationship with the obvious logical buyer and they are engaged. The last thing you want to do is introduce something into the mix that could, upset a positive, dynamic between you and the buyer. In many instances, we have been hired, but take a backseat and allow the principals to negotiate where we're there as counsel. So sometimes we do that. With respect to, so again, it really is case specific. I wouldn't, I wouldn't force it isn't, the rule book doesn't say always hire a banker and run a process. The rule book is, very, very case specific. And there are many, many cases where not having a banker probably works just fine. With respect to the dual track capital raise, M&A, I would tell you, that from a buyer standpoint, you're sending a flashing red light. I mean, this company is running out of money, and if they don't raise the capital, so all it tells the buyer is wait them out. So, what my advice would be, always, if you're thinking about an M&A, don't wait till your cash runs out and you're down to your last 3 months. You're doing a dual track. Launch a process right after you've raised capital. So just think ahead, because from a buyer perspective, the second they see, and of course they're going to hear in the marketplace that you're out there raising capital, most buyers kind of say, okay, this could come to me, and I'm really interested, but let me wait this out. And and again, it also impacts your capital raise process because, again, investors are saying, wait, do I want to invest the time to get to understand this company, to, do all the work, put a term sheet, negotiate it. And I'm just going to get, I'll be wasting time because someone buys the company. So again, I'm not a huge fan of these dual track processes.
Right. Thank you,
Awesome.
Naveen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. We did get two questions from KK, but I think it may be best if KK's questions are sent directly to you, Naveen, as a contact point because of some sensitivity in the questions. But there's another one from Shumei. She wants to ask a question. So Shumei, please go ahead.
Hi, Naveen. How are you? It's Shimei here from Michael Dell Biotech. We're based in Ireland. So I just have a question. Our headquarters in Ireland, we do lots of R&Ds and develop product for, to reduce heavy metals in food, in crops, and increase crop yield. However, we have a very established operation in China for the last 3 years. And at this moment, we have product registered, and based on the Chinese market analysis, our company, like the subsidiaries in China, could have a very good chance to go to the IPO in China. And then now we just finished our Series A fundraising as well, for the overall company, and we are planning like 3 years, 5 years ahead, how this company is going to exit. So now we have options, like a IPO for the subsidiary in China. And also we do have a suite of companies that, in our eye that we could, in the future for exit M&A by them, globally outside China. So just looking at the strategy point, have you ever experienced a company have their subsidiary to exit in a different region and still outside that region, the company can, as a package, to exit for a bigger company, for example, Bayer or Nestle or, those big giant company? Is this been seen by you before? Or is it, we just make sure that whatever we do, as IPO in a regional country, or is exit for a big company is not conflict to each other?
I don't think it's a good question. I don't think it's necessarily a conflict. I mean, listen,
Okay.
if what you're doing is logical from a value maximization standpoint and
Okay.
a capital efficiency standpoint. So if it's, you're going to raise capital at the most attractive, way possible, which might be an IPO in your Chinese subsidiary, and, you preserve your Irish company, in private, that's the right answer. You should do it. Does it complicate things? Again, now you get into a lot of questions around intellectual property and how that's shared between the parent and the Chinese subsidiary. It gets a little bit more complicated. But from a value maximization standpoint, if that's the right answer, I think you should think about it. Now, if you're far enough along where some of your, the companies that may be interested in buying the whole company have an active interest in your Chinese subsidiary, you may want to test the waters before you pull the trigger on the IPO to make sure that, some buyers may have an issue with it. And you don't want to put yourself in a place where you've taken a step in one direction, but it's hurting the other process. So I'd get a gauge of that. Obviously, I don't spend a lot of time in your sector, so I'm not fluent in how this would impact it or not.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Naveen. Don't see any other questions, but if folks need to get in touch with you, Naveen, what would be the best way to do so?
Sure. My email is Nataraj, Nataraj, at Evercore, Evercore.com.
Thank you very much. And that was a wonderful session, Naveen, and really very insightful. Thank you for taking the time to be able to join us and for being an XTC partner. So really appreciate it.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.